앤드류 회장님 안녕하십니까. 이렇게 시간 내주셔서 감사하고요. 그리고 저희 첫 질문은 이제 현재 세계 경제를 좀 진단해 주시고 앞으로 세계 경제 위기가 회복될 것인지 아니면 악화될 것인지 여기에 대해서 좀 답변해 주시기 바랍니다.
The world economy is going through a slow growth period at the moment. There are significant uncertainties about the eurozone crisis outcomes, the US presidential election, the turmoil in the Middle East, and finally whether China will achieve a hard or soft landing. Where you have these four events coalescing, business is very reluctant to make significant investment decisions, and this will mean a very flat economy for the next 6 months.
Economic crisis right now will become worse or better in future?
I think the economy will be very flat, but then I think in 2013 I'm hopeful that we'll start to see growth return to the global economy. Why? Because I think at that stage we'll see a clear leadership change in China. We'll have a new president, we'll know who the president is in the United States. The eurozone crisis will have advanced in terms of its resolution, and I think it's likely that politics in the Middle East will also be more certain. Against this backdrop, there's a lot of pent-up demand that businesses have to spend their cash and to invest in new and emerging markets. And I think we'll start to see this occur in 2013.
My next question is about Korean economy. Can you diagnose present status of Korean economy in particular?
Well, the Korean economy is very export focused and very exposed to China. So a lot depends on China's recovery. But China is only going to grow now on a very different path of 8%, maybe 7%. So I think Korea has to find new markets, and it has some world-class goods that it needs to take into some of these new economies. At the same time, it may be that the Korean economy has to do more to stimulate domestic demand and to open up to more foreign investment, because Korea is now becoming a very mature economy, very predictable, but a lot of investors like this predictability.
The most serious problem in Korean economy?
I think like any economy, Korea has some challenges. I think the number one is you're too reliant on China for your economy. Secondly, you have a birth rate is very low at the moment, and this is, for long-term projections, as most investors do, this is a potential problem for Korea. I think also you've had some difficulty in the savings and loans banks, household debts situation. So, like any country, there has to be some deleveraging, some austerity and restructure to allow the repositioning of the Korean economy. But Korea is still regarded as a pretty strong economy compared to many others.
At this moment in Korea, there's a controversial debate on economic democratization. Have you heard of that?
No.
It's an issue of more regulating on corporates.
Yeah.
Have you heard of chaebol?
Yes.
Right, those big corporates, yes. And Korea is trying to have more regulations to them, adding more regulations to them for medium-sized, small and medium-sized to grow, as they are dominating the major businesses. Mm-hmm. So, what do you think about this? There are presidential candidates are enforcing such promises to people for, as a populism or whatever it's called. But so, what do you think about this?
I think one of the great uncertainties in the world at the moment is extreme capitalism the right way, or is a centrally managed economy the right way? And no one knows. There are different models that are actually emerging, and part of Korea's success has been based upon the very fact that you have had these large conglomerate groups who have invested in difficult economic times, but it's also important to basically decrease your reliance just on those 5 companies and have policies that allow new and emerging middle-class businesses to be competitive in the domestic market. So I think you have to get the balance right between having globally competitive companies but still allowing the fostering of the new growth companies in the future. This is always very challenging for governments to achieve.
What kind of plan should Korean government and corporate prepare for sustainable growth?
I think first thing it has to give a very clear plan so that the markets understand what is the direction of Korea. Equally, I think there has to be an increase in corporate governance standards in Korea so that foreign investors feel that they can invest with a degree of confidence in the Korean market. There is certainty about government supporting their investments, that there is transparency and the same standards that they see in other markets are available in Korea. Because there is a lot of competition emerging for capital at the moment, and many countries are making the necessary reforms.
Can you define strengths and weaknesses of Korean corporates?
Oh, look, I think Korea is world class in understanding consumer tastes and consumer products, and almost in advance. So customer segmentation, understanding which are the new markets, which are the buying levels, and then they produce the highest quality, best priced goods in the world. I think whether it be motor vehicles, whether it be tablets or semiconductors, I think Korea is world class in this area. But if you're reliant on technology, you always have to have the next set of patents and ideas. So to me, it's the research, innovation and patenting which will really define Korea's future.
So what will be their weaknesses in?
I think, the weaknesses is that I don't think Korea market is well understood by foreign investors. It's been very closed and regulated in certain areas. It's been traditionally very reliant on exports, not domestic opportunities. Right. And I think there's an ageing population, which concerns investors in consumer markets.
So how do you evaluate the globalization of Korean economy and Korean corporations? As you said, you're here to tell about the globalization trend.
Well, I think globalization has been very good for a country like Korea because Korea has embraced it more than others and gone into these new and emerging markets and being able to expand its capacity through exports. The concern would be that if many countries now take a domestic agenda and put protectionist measures up, that this may harm Korea's trade flow. So to me, Korea has a vested interest in making sure that as a head of the free trade agreements, that it increases the capacity for globalisation, but it must set an example in its own domestic market as well to prove that it is open for business.
On your side, what are the recent concerns of your major clients in common?
I think the major concerns of our client are for the impact of regulation on their business. Secondly, how to do business in these new and emerging markets because they don't have the skills and the expertise of how to do this. Third, they're worried about the availability of funds to fund their expansion. So there is a contraction in the banking sector and also the IPO markets are dead. So it's very difficult to raise capital and debt to achieve this. The fourth is this whole issue about business ethics and culture. And there are many accusations being made about business at the moment, whether it be in Occupy Wall Street or whether it be scandals from regulators. So businesses are concerned to ensure that throughout their organisation there is a culture of doing the right thing and contributing more to society.
How do you define the responsible capitalism?
Responsible capitalism is understanding that there's a broader set of stakeholders, and if you want to operate your business, you must understand the requirements and contribute to the well-being. So it's not just about your shareholders, it's about the communities in which you operate, it's about your employees, it's about your customers and your suppliers, and making sure that they have responsible standards and behaviours around this. So you're now seeing many major corporations require their suppliers to reduce their carbon footprint or to make sure that their labour relations in certain countries are to world standard.
So in case of KPMG, can you tell us one example for such?
Well, for example, in KPMG, two things. We have basically lowered our carbon footprint by over 30% since we've done this in the last 2 or 3 years. And every one of our buildings now must be Green Star standard. Secondly, we have made a huge contribution to society, and every one of our practices would be sponsoring community days, contributing to not-for-profits. We have built schools in northern China. We have built orphanages in Tanzania. We are working in Kenya in terms of disadvantaged women. We are putting women diversity employment programs into Saudi Arabia. So everywhere in the world, we see ourselves as having a responsibility to contribute to our community.
I heard that KPMG is having an audit in Spanish banks because of this crisis. How serious is their mismanagement in the banking system?
Well, it's not a question really of mismanagement. It's a question of really understanding what the current state of the Spanish banks are, because you've seen a huge decline in property values there. You've seen some of the commercial investments in Spain not be very successful, so they are very high leverage in many corporations, and you need to determine the recoverability of those loans. And now when you have significant downturn in Spanish domestic economy, things like credit card risk or mortgages values become quite important. So all we're doing is trying to assess what the current state of the financial system in Spain is at the moment, to help the Bank of Spain then make decisions with the European Union about what additional capital might be required.
So how do you think this eurozone crisis will affect the Asian economy?
Well, clearly the eurozone crisis is having a major impact on the Asian economy, because Asia is the largest exporter into Europe, so inevitably they're going to be impacted. Secondly, many of the European banks have funded the growth of the Asian economy, and they're now retracting their funds back to head office to meet the new regulatory standards which are being imposed upon them. So in that sense it will have a big impact. But you're now starting to see other Asian banks, Australian banks, start to emerge and take their place, and I think the future of the Chinese banks will be extremely interesting, and I think this is a very big opportunity for countries like China and Singapore and even Korea to start to come into this marketplace without the degree of competition. Equally, they were starting to trade more among themselves, and when I talk to my major clients, everyone wants to increase their market share in this part of the region. So you're going to see more and more foreign investment come from minor multinationals into this region. So you might see some turbulence for 18 months, but I think in the medium to long term, the future in Asia is very bright.
So how long do you think this eurozone crisis would last?
Well, I think there are several crises in Europe. So I think the number one is the banking crisis. I think this will only last until early in 2013, and then I think we will see resolution. I think there is a genuine focus now by regulators to get this fixed. Then there is the governance crisis. It's the reform. This will take 5 years, and politically this is quite challenging. And then there is the competitiveness crisis as to how Europe can compete with these new and emerging economies. This will take a decade and 20 years, I think, to really play out.
So, coming back to the questions on Korea, how do you evaluate risk management ability in Korean corporates? It seems crucial at this point since the crisis.
My sense is that Korean companies are relatively well advanced in terms of assessing risk. I think they're very numerate, they're very analytical in the way they go about those things, and because they have a global footprint, they have some good information and knowledge about this. So when I met in recent days with many Korean CEOs, I found them quite conservative and quite anxious about the risks at the moment and willing to talk about them. But that said, clearly there were some problems in too much leverage and too much debt in the Korean economy, and sometimes assets have been bought at record high prices, highly leveraged, and this has caused some problems in the Korean system. So whether historically they fully understood the risk, you probably have a better judgment than I will.
Could you give the best and the worst example of this risk managing companies?
Oh, well, I think the very fact that you've had a savings and loans crisis here is the worst example, where you had a whole system where clearly the business model failed and, as an example of not fully understanding what I call the endogenous risk, the inherent risk in the system. But some people did understand that type of risk. For example, KPMG did no audits in this area. In terms of the best example of risk, I think some of your large corporates have been able to diversify and find new product opportunities and new technologies in competition with the best in the world. And I think they've understood the changing market dynamic and the different types of consumers coming through and what they need. And I think Korea is world class in this.
So, how do you predict the future of Korean economy in broad sense? How do you predict Korean economy future?
Well, Korea is now a mature economy and needs to recognise that its ability to be a low-cost, high-quality manufacturer is more challenged. So it has to look at lowering that cost base, and it has to look at diversifying into new markets, and it also has to open up its domestic market to more foreign investment to stimulate its demand and competitiveness around this. But, you know, Korea is still very mysterious to a lot of Western investors, and I think there needs to be a little bit of a campaign to educate Western investors about the potential of having a long-term stable market here, which means you must have the confidence that the government will consistently honour foreign investment here, that they will make the necessary corporate governance reforms to make sure that foreign investors feel comfortable investing here, and that people be prepared to invest in new technology and new ideas.
마이클 앤드루 회장님 이렇게 시간 내주셔서 감사하고요. 예, 다음에 또 뵐 수 있는 기회가 있었으면 좋겠습니다. 감사합니다.